Hi everyone. NATO is turning into a deadly trap for its own military. Last night, Russian high-precision strikes in Odessa hit a real den of mercenaries and instructors from the North Atlantic Alliance. An elite sabotage unit of the Ukrainian armed forces, supervised by British submariners, was wiped off the face of the earth. According to the coordinator of the Nikolaev Underground, the outcome is merciless. 8 NATO officers, including at least 2 Americans, and dozens of Ukrainian special forces were eliminated. American professor John Mearsheimer openly stated, "Russia's victory in Ukraine, coupled with other challenges, will create a deadly combination that will effectively destroy NATO. And Russia is finishing off the alliance diplomatically by offering to legally enshrine a non-aggression pact." Chinese media state, "This is a trap from which there is no escape." Signing the treaty means admitting that there is no Russian threat and depriving NATO of its reason for existence. Refusing means exposing itself as an aggressive bloc thirsty for war. There is a deathly silence at the alliance headquarters. Today we will analyze the entire operation in Odessa, from the discovery of the NATO instructors' base to the destruction of 8 alliance officers. We will find out why Western experts recognize Ukraine as a deadly trap for NATO. And most importantly, we will understand how Russia has driven the alliance into a diplomatic dead end from which there is no way out without admitting its own falsehood. Stay until the end, because in the finale, I will show you documents about the scale of NATO's presence in Ukraine and a list of facilities where NATO instructors are hiding. And secondly, we will analyze why the non-aggression pact has become the diplomatic bomb that could blow up the alliance from within. Let's start with the operation in Odessa. On January 11, 2026, at night, Russian high-precision strikes were carried out on a facility in Odessa. The coordinator of the Nikolaev Underground, Sergei Lebedev, a representative of the pro-Russian resistance in southern Ukraine, told RIA Novosti the details of the operation. According to him, the target of the strike was the base of an elite sabotage unit of the Ukrainian armed forces, which operated under the direct supervision of instructors from NATO countries. The peculiarity of this unit, specialization in naval sabotage, mining of the water area, attacks on ships. The unit was supervised by British submariners, officers of the Royal Navy of Great Britain, specialists in underwater operations. The base was located in the industrial zone of Odessa, disguised as a civilian facility. Russian intelligence had been monitoring this facility for several weeks, recording movement, communications, and equipment supplies. It was established that foreign military specialists are constantly at the base. Training of Ukrainian saboteurs is being conducted, and operations against Russian ships and port infrastructure in Crimea and Novorossiysk are being planned. The decision to strike was made after intelligence recorded the arrival of a group of high-ranking NATO officers at the base for a coordination meeting. This was an opportunity to strike at the command echelon, to eliminate not ordinary instructors, but senior officers coordinating all the activities of NATO forces in southern Ukraine. Why is this important? Because for the first time during the conflict, Russia deliberately destroyed a significant group of senior NATO officers in one place. These are not accidental losses, not collateral damage from a strike on Ukrainian facilities. This is a targeted operation to eliminate the alliance's command staff working in Ukraine. What does this change? This changes NATO's calculations for the deployment of its military personnel on Ukrainian territory. Until now, the alliance believed that its officers were in relative safety, hiding among Ukrainian soldiers, disguising their bases as civilian facilities. The strike in Odessa showed that Russian intelligence identifies these facilities, tracks the presence of NATO military personnel, and launches targeted strikes. Let's analyze the details of the operation. The strike was carried out around 3:00 a.m. local time. Sea-based cruise missiles were used, presumably Calibers, launched from ships of the Black Sea Fleet. The number of missiles, according to various estimates, ranged from 1 to 5. All missiles hit the target with the highest accuracy. The base building was almost completely destroyed. Explosions of colossal power destroyed all 3 floors of the structure, turning it into a pile of rubble. According to Lebedev, at the time of the strike, there were about 40 Ukrainian servicemen and 8 NATO officers at the base. The outcome of the operation: all Ukrainian servicemen who were in the building at the time of the strike died. None of the 8 NATO officers survived. Among the dead are at least 2 American officers, presumably from the U.S. Special Operations Command. The remaining 6 officers were from Great Britain, including 2 underwater operations specialists from the elite Special Boat Service Unit. These are the largest losses of NATO officer personnel in a single operation since the beginning of the conflict. 8 senior officers killed simultaneously is a disaster for the alliance. The losses of British submariners are especially painful. These are specialized personnel who are trained for years. They cannot be quickly replaced. Write in the comments whether you consider the targeted destruction of NATO officers on the territory of Ukraine to be justified. Formally, they are not military personnel of a country at war with Russia, but in fact, they are fighting against Russia. Now about NATO's reaction. Officially, the alliance is silent. There are no statements about losses, no comments about the operation. This is understandable. Admitting that 8 NATO officers were killed in Ukraine means admitting the alliance's direct participation in the war against Russia. And this is already a completely different level of conflict, but unofficially. There is panic in NATO circles. Sources in European military structures report that after the strike in Odessa, an emergency evacuation of NATO military specialists from the most dangerous areas of Ukraine began. Officers who previously worked in frontline zones are being withdrawn to the western regions or completely outside the country. Great Britain has already announced a reduction in its military presence in Ukraine. Officially, due to the need for rotation, unofficially due to unacceptably high risks. The American Special Operations Command is also reviewing the rules for the deployment of its officers, prohibiting them from being in facilities that can be identified by Russian intelligence. This is an acknowledgement of the fact. Ukraine has become a deadly trap for NATO military personnel. Russia has proven its ability to identify and destroy the facilities where they are located. The risk of losses has become unacceptably high. It is in this context that the words of American professor John Mearsheimer, one of the leading experts in international relations, a realist who warned about the catastrophic consequences of NATO expansion to the east even before the start of the conflict, sound. Mearsheimer stated, "The issue of Ukraine is closely intertwined with the question of the future existence of NATO. Many have said before that if Russia wins in Ukraine, which will certainly happen, it will do serious damage to the alliance. Now, if we link this simple fact about what is happening in Ukraine with a possible invasion of Greenland, we can argue that this will be a deadly combination that will effectively destroy the alliance. Pay attention to the wording. Russia will win in Ukraine, which will certainly happen. Cannot happen, unlikely to happen, but will certainly happen. A leading American expert directly states, "The defeat of Ukraine and the victory of Russia are inevitable, and this defeat will destroy NATO." Why is this important? Because this is not a marginal opinion, not pro-Russian propaganda. This is the position of one of the most authoritative experts in international relations in the United States, a professor at the University of Chicago, the author of classic works on the theory of international politics. When such a person talks about the collapse of NATO, it is worth listening to. What does this change? This changes the narrative in Western elites. Until now, the dominant position was, NATO must help Ukraine until victory, because the defeat of Ukraine will weaken the alliance. Mearsheimer reverses this logic. Continuing the war destroys NATO more than admitting defeat. The adventure with Ukraine turned out to be suicidal for the alliance. Let's analyze Mearsheimer's logic in more detail. NATO was created as a defensive alliance against the Soviet threat. After the collapse of the USSR, the alliance sought a new justification for its existence. Expansion to the east, the fight against terrorism, the protection of democracy. All these are attempts to justify the preservation of a military bloc in the absence of a clear enemy. The Ukrainian conflict has become the culmination of this policy. NATO has effectively declared its goal to be the strategic defeat of Russia. All the power of the alliance, all resources are thrown into supporting Ukraine. And what is the result? Ukraine is losing. Russia is winning. NATO turns out to be powerless to stop Russia. This is a disaster for the authority of the alliance. If NATO cannot ensure the victory of its protege, who receives hundreds of billions of dollars in aid, thousands of pieces of equipment, full intelligence support, then what is this alliance capable of at all? Why pay contributions to an organization that cannot fulfill its tasks? Mearsheimer adds another factor: the possible U.S. invasion of Greenland. This is a separate topic related to Trump's statements about the strategic importance of Greenland. If the U.S. really tries to forcibly establish control over Greenland, this will cause a crisis in relations with Denmark, a member of NATO. The alliance will be split. The combination of two factors, defeat in Ukraine and a split over Greenland, according to Mearsheimer, will be deadly for NATO. The alliance will not withstand a simultaneous blow to its authority from the outside and a split from the inside. And against the background of this crisis, Russia strikes a diplomatic blow from which NATO cannot recover. Moscow has officially proposed to legally enshrine a treaty on mutual non-aggression between Russia and NATO countries. It would seem that what could be simpler, if NATO is really a defensive alliance, if it has no aggressive intentions against Russia, then why not sign a non-aggression pact? This will strengthen security in Europe, reduce the risks of military conflict, and create a legal basis for peaceful coexistence. But Chinese media accurately identified the essence of this proposal. Putin suddenly played the diplomatic card of mutual non-aggression, putting NATO in a dilemma. Legal fixation of this proposal will undermine the foundations of the bloc's existence, and rejection of it will expose the alliance's desire to maintain the Russian threat. This is a brilliant diplomatic move. Russia puts NATO before a choice with no right answers. Signing the treaty means admitting that Russia does not pose a threat, that it is ready for peaceful coexistence, that all of NATO's anti-Russian rhetoric was a lie. And if there is no threat, then why is NATO needed? What is the point of a military alliance directed against a country with which a non-aggression pact has been signed? Refusing the treaty means publicly admitting NATO does not want peace with Russia. The alliance is interested in maintaining confrontation. This whole story about Russian aggression is a myth invented to justify the existence of a military bloc. This is an exposure before the whole world. There is indeed a deathly silence at NATO headquarters. There is no official response to the Russian proposal because any answer is a loss. Silence is also a loss, but at least not such a public one. Write how you think. Will NATO sign a non-aggression pact with Russia or find a way to refuse without losing face? Let's analyze the situation more deeply. NATO was built on the concept of deterring the Soviet and then the Russian threat. The whole point of the alliance's existence is to protect against Russia. If Russia publicly offers a non-aggression pact and NATO refuses, this proves the alliance is not interested in peace, it is interested in confrontation. European NATO member countries are in a particularly difficult situation. Their population is tired of confrontation, of sanctions, of rising energy prices. People want peace. If their government refuses to sign a non-aggression pact with Russia, this will cause mass discontent. Why are you refusing peace? So you want war. On the other hand, signing the treaty undermines the ideological basis of NATO. The alliance positions itself as a defender against aggressive Russia. If a non-aggression pact is signed with this aggressive Russia, then who should be defended from? The whole narrative collapses. The U.S. is in an even more difficult situation. Washington has invested huge resources in creating the image of Russia as an existential threat. The entire U.S. strategy in Europe is built on maintaining this threat. If Russia ceases to be a threat, why are American bases in Europe needed? Why is the American military presence needed? Why should Europeans buy American weapons and obey American politics? The non-aggression pact destroys American hegemony in Europe, so Washington will fiercely resist this idea. But how to explain to Europeans why the U.S. is against peace with Russia? Any explanation will look cynical and imperialistic. Russia has created a diplomatic trap from which there is no escape. NATO is doomed to lose, regardless of what decision it makes. It will sign the treaty, undermine the foundations of its existence, refuse, expose itself as an aggressive bloc, remain silent, show weakness and inability to dialogue. This is a strategy worthy of a great power. Russia is not just fighting on the battlefield, it is fighting in the information, diplomatic, and ideological space. And in these spaces, Russia is winning. Now let's connect everything together. The strike in Odessa. The destruction of 8 NATO officers is a military victory. Mearsheimer's statement about the inevitable collapse of the alliance is a recognition of NATO's strategic defeat. The proposal of a non-aggression pact is a diplomatic coup de grace, a stroke of mercy for the dying alliance. NATO is in a situation where all its actions work against it. Helping Ukraine depletes resources, but does not bring victory. Deploying officers in Ukraine leads to their death. Expansion to the east provoked a conflict that the alliance cannot win. Refusal of the non-aggression pact exposes the true goals of the alliance. Western elites are beginning to understand that the adventure with Ukraine was a catastrophic mistake. Instead of the strategic defeat of Russia, the alliance receives its own strategic defeat. Ukraine has turned not into a bridgehead for pressure on Russia, but into a cemetery of NATO ambitions. The coordinator of the Nikolaev Underground, Lebedev, in his message about the strike in Odessa, emphasized. The Kremlin coldly states that the Russian army strikes only military targets and will not touch residential areas, unlike the punishers of the Ukrainian armed forces. This is an important statement. Russia positions itself as a party that observes the laws and customs of war, in contrast to Ukraine and its Western curators. The base in Odessa was a legitimate military target. There were military specialists there. Combat operations were planned and coordinated. This is not a civilian object, not a residential building, not a hospital. This is military infrastructure. Its destruction complies with international law. But the fact remains, 8 NATO officers died. For their families, for their countries, for the alliance as a whole, this is a tragedy. And this is a tragedy that will be repeated if NATO continues to deploy its military personnel on Ukrainian territory. Mearsheimer is right. Ukraine has become a deadly trap for NATO. The alliance cannot win this conflict, but it cannot get out of it without losing face. Each day of the war brings new losses, material, reputational, human. The strike in Odessa is just one episode in this long history of defeats. We are witnessing a historical moment, the decline of the North Atlantic Alliance. An organization that has determined the military-political structure of Europe for 75 years has proved unable to cope with the challenge thrown by Russia. The Ukrainian conflict has exposed all of NATO's weaknesses: inability to make quick decisions, dependence on the United States, lack of unity between members, limited military capabilities. Russia is methodically destroying the myth of NATO's omnipotence. By military means, destroying NATO weapons and NATO military personnel in Ukraine. By diplomatic means, offering a non-aggression pact that the alliance can neither accept nor reject. By information means, demonstrating to the whole world the weakness and hypocrisy of the alliance. Follow the development of events. This is a truly historical process. The collapse of the security system created after the Cold War. NATO may formally exist for years to come, but as a real military force, the alliance is already dead. Ukraine has become its grave. And now write in the comments whether you agree with Mearsheimer that NATO is moving towards collapse, or the alliance will be able to overcome the crisis and emerge from the Ukrainian adventure without catastrophic consequences. Because this is indeed a fateful question for the entire system of international relations. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for staying until the end. The strike in Odessa, Mearsheimer's words. Russia's diplomatic trap. All these are elements of a big picture. A picture of the decline of one era and the birth of another. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. Times are changing, and we are witnesses to these changes. M.